My father's message arrived at 2:13 a.m., and I knew before I even opened it that it wasn't love calling, it was control, because my dad never texted that late unless something had gone wrong in a way he expected me to fix, and the screen lit up my dark bedroom with 5 words that made my stomach tighten instantly. Call me now. It's urgent, and I lay there listening to the rain tapping against the window, feeling the familiar childhood instinct to obey rise up like a reflex, but I didn't move yet, because obedience had cost me too much already, and when I finally called, he answered on the first ring, voice sharp, breathless. You need to come home tomorrow, he said. No greeting, no warmth, just a demand, and I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around my shoulders like armor. Dad, what happened? And he exhaled hard as if I was wasting time. Your sister did something stupid, he snapped, and the word stupid in his mouth always meant dangerous, always meant expensive, and I closed my eyes. What did she do? And there was a pause, the kind of pause where someone is deciding how much truth to admit. Then he said, there's a problem at her office. Money missing. Accounts flagged, and my pulse jumped. Flagged how? And my father's voice dropped lower, heavier. Fraud. And the word landed like ice, because fraud isn't a mistake you trip into, it's a choice you make with both eyes open. And I whispered, did she steal? And my father barked, she didn't steal, she panicked, as if panic excused theft, as if fear rewrote law. And then he said the sentence that changed the air in my room completely, you're going to cover it, and for a moment I thought I misheard. What? I said softly, and he repeated, firmer, you have savings. You have that trust from grandma. You're going to pay the debt before this becomes public, and my throat tightened. Dad, why would I pay for something I didn't do? And his voice sharpened instantly, because your family, the weapon word, the word they used when they wanted my resources but not my boundaries, and I swallowed hard. Family doesn't commit fraud and hand me the bill, and my father's patience snapped. Don't you dare judge her, he said, and I could hear in his voice that he wasn't afraid of what my sister had done. He was afraid of exposure, of reputation, of consequences reaching him, and I said quietly, no, and silence hit the line like a slap. Then my father's tone turned cold, controlled. No, he repeated, as if the concept was foreign, and I held my breath. No, Dad. I'm not paying, and for a second there was nothing. Then his voice came out low and dangerous. Listen to me very carefully, he said. If you don't help your sister, I will make sure you regret it. And my pulse hammered. Is that a threat? And he didn't deny it. He leaned into it. I have contacts. I know people at your firm. You think your little career is untouchable? And my skin went cold, because my father wasn't just asking, he was trying to take my future hostage, and he continued, you will transfer the money by Friday, or I will burn everything you've built. And my hands trembled around the phone. Not from fear of losing money, but from realizing how easily he was willing to destroy me to protect her, and I whispered, Dad, this isn't love, and he snapped, this is responsibility, the other weapon word, and before I could speak again, he ended the call, leaving only silence and the soft hiss of rain, and I sat there with my heart pounding, thinking of my sister, always reckless, always protected, the golden child who could set fires and call it warmth, while I was expected to bring the water and apologize for making a mess. And by morning, the text started, my sister, Ava, sending crying emojis and empty apologies. I didn't mean for this to happen, she wrote, please don't let Dad down, and my mother followed with a message that made my jaw clench, be the bigger person. Fix this quietly, always quietly, because quiet meant no one held them accountable, and I stared at my phone until something inside me shifted, not into rage, but into clarity, because my father thought threats were power, he thought my silence was consent, he thought I would panic and pay, but what he didn't know was that my job, my career, the one he was threatening, had taught me something far more effective than panic. It had taught me procedure, paper trails, silent alarms, the kind of traps that don't look like traps until they close, and I didn't shout back, I didn't beg, I didn't argue, I simply opened my laptop, logged into my accounts, and began documenting every message, every threat, every demand, because if my father wanted to play this game, I would not play it loudly, I would play it legally, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a calm thought formed with frightening certainty. Ava's fraud wasn't the only crime happening here, my father's threat was one too, and by midnight, he was going to learn what happens when you try to burn someone's career and they respond with a silent trap instead. I didn't sleep that night, not because fear kept me awake, but because clarity did, the kind of clarity that rewires you when you finally understand your role in someone else's story, and by sunrise I had a folder on my desktop labeled Ava, inside it screenshots of every message, my father's threat typed in cold black letters, call logs time stamped at 2:13 a.m. And a quiet email drafted to Elaine Harper, The same attorney who had helped my grandmother structure my trust with safeguards, because grandma always said, family can be warm, but money makes them reckless, and she was right. And when my sister texted again begging me to meet her, I agreed, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I needed to see how deep the lie went. So I drove to a small cafe near her apartment, one of those places that pretends to be cozy while everyone inside is tense. And Ava was already there, mascara smudged, fingers wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking, her eyes snapping up when she saw me like a child caught mid-theft. "Thank God," she whispered, standing too quickly, "Olivia, please," and I sat across from her without hugging, without softness, because softness is what my family used to turn boundaries into weakness, and Ava's voice trembled. "I didn't want this," and I tilted my head. "Then why did it happen?" And she swallowed hard, looking down. "It was one mistake," she said, "one transfer that got flagged," and I watched her carefully. "A transfer from where?" And she hesitated. "Too long, from a client account," she admitted, and the air tightened, because client accounts aren't piggy banks, and I asked quietly, "How much?" and her lips parted. Then she whispered, 200,000, and the number hit like a physical blow, because my father was demanding I drain my future to plug her crime, and I kept my voice steady. "And Dad wants me to pay," and Ava's eyes filled. "He's trying to save me," and I laughed once, sharp. "He's trying to save himself," and Ava flinched as if the truth stung. "You don't understand," she whispered, "if this comes out, I'm finished," and I leaned forward slightly. "You finished yourself when you touched money that wasn't yours," and she shook her head desperately. I was desperate, the word my family loved because it made wrongdoing sound like weather instead of choice, and I asked, "Desperate for what?" And Ava's voice cracked, "For time," and I stared, "Time for what?" And she hesitated again, and that hesitation told me more than her tears ever could, because Ava wasn't just scared, she was hiding layers, and before I could press, my phone buzzed. A text from Dad. "Have you agreed yet?" And another immediately after. "Remember what I said about your job?" And my stomach hardened, because threats are louder when written, and I showed Ava the screen. "This is what he's doing," and she looked away, ashamed. "He's under pressure," she whispered, and I narrowed my eyes. "From who?" And Ava's voice dropped. "From the board," and I froze. "What board?" And she swallowed. "Dad's," and the world shifted, because my father didn't work in Ava's company. He had no reason to be pressured by her workplace unless he was involved, and my voice went quiet. "Dad sits on your company's advisory board," and Ava nodded slowly, tears slipping. "He helped me get the job," and my chest tightened, because suddenly this wasn't just a sister stealing, it was a father entangled, reputation tied to fraud, and I understood why he was panicking, why he was threatening my career, because if Ava fell, he fell with her, and he needed a scapegoat, a payer, a person to absorb the consequences while he stayed clean, and I asked, "Did you tell anyone else?" And Ava whispered, "No, just Dad," and I leaned back, absorbing. "So Dad's plan is to make me the solution," and Ava grabbed my hand suddenly, desperate. "Olivia, please, if you don't help, they'll investigate," and I pulled my hand back gently. "They should investigate," I said, and Ava's face crumpled. "You'd let me go to jail," and I held her gaze. "I'd let you face what you did, and the difference matters," and Ava's voice rose. "Dad said you'd ruin us," and I breathed slowly. "Dad is already ruining me," and in that moment I saw it clearly. Ava wasn't begging because she loved me. She was begging because she needed me, because my trust, my savings, my clean record were her exit, and when I didn't move, her desperation sharpened into something else. "If you don't pay," she whispered, "Dad will do it anyway," and my blood went cold. "Do what anyway?" And Ava's lips trembled. "He said he could access your trust," and the cafe seemed to narrow around me. "Access it how?" And Ava's voice broke. "Through Mom," and I felt the floor tilt, because my mother was a co-signer on some old accounts from when I was younger. Accounts I never thought about because I trusted her, and Ava continued, terrified. "He said if you won't be family, he'll force you," and I realized then the fraud wasn't only Ava's, the crime wasn't only hers. My father was plotting to steal from me to cover her theft. And suddenly the threat against my career wasn't the only weapon, it was distraction, smoke, while he reached for my money, and I stood slowly, heart pounding. "When?" I asked, voice tight. "When would he do that?" And Ava whispered, "Tonight," and something inside me went still. Because tonight was the deadline in his mind, tonight was the moment he thought he would push me into compliance or take what he wanted anyway, and I looked at my sister, at her shaking hands and ruined makeup, and I understood that begging was over, the trap needed to close, so I nodded once, letting my face soften just enough, and I said quietly, "Okay," and Ava blinked, hope flashing, "Okay," and I forced a small smile, "Tell Dad I'm thinking," and Ava exhaled like she'd been drowning. "Thank you," she whispered, And I walked out of the cafe with my phone already in my hand, because the moment I stepped into the sunlight, I called Elaine, and when she answered, I said calmly, "It's worse than we thought," and Elaine's voice sharpened, "How worse?" And I replied, "They're going to try to take it tonight," and Elaine paused only a second before saying, "Then tonight, we set the silent trap," and my pulse steadied, because my father believed midnight was his deadline, but midnight was about to become his exposure. Elaine didn't tell me to panic, she didn't tell me to run, she told me to be precise, because precision is what separates victims from witnesses, and as I sat in my car outside the cafe with my hands steady on the wheel, she said, "Listen carefully, Olivia, if they attempt unauthorized access to your trust, we let them," and my stomach tightened, "Let them?" And Elaine's tone was calm, "We don't stop the attempt, we document it, we trigger the compliance clause your grandmother built, and we make sure the bank's fraud unit sees the full chain," and I swallowed hard, because the idea of letting my own father reach for my money felt like opening the door to a fire, but Elaine was right, the fire was already there, pretending it wouldn't keep me warm, and she continued, "Do you still have the dual authentication alert enabled?" And I nodded though she couldn't see, "Yes," and Elaine said, "Good, because tonight we're adding an additional protective flag, a monitored transaction hold. Any attempt to transfer funds will create an automatic report," and my pulse steadied into something colder than fear. "Will they be arrested?" I asked, and Elaine paused. "This isn't about spectacle," she replied, "it's about accountability. The institution will act, regulators will act, and your father will not be able to threaten his way out of an audit." And I exhaled slowly, because audits are the kind of punishment manipulators can't charm, and by evening, Elaine and I were in a private meeting room at the bank's compliance office, where everything smelled like sanitizer and seriousness, and a compliance officer named Mr. Chen sat across from us, listening as Elaine explained the situation in crisp legal language: forged access risk, coercion, pending fraud from a related party, and Mr. Chen's expression didn't change because he'd seen this pattern before. Families treating accounts like inheritance was a weapon, and he nodded once. "We can place a monitored hold," he said. "Any attempted transfer will be flagged internally and escalated," and my throat tightened. "Will they be notified?" And Mr. Chen shook his head, "Not until after the attempt is recorded," and Elaine's eyes met mine. This was the trap, silent, clean, legal, and at 9:47 p.m. I received a text from my father, "Last chance. Transfer it now or I start making calls," and my fingers trembled for a moment, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was grieving the fact that he was willing to burn me to save Ava, and I typed back only 2 words, as Elaine instructed, "I understand," just enough to keep him moving forward, just enough to let him believe he still had the wheel, and an hour later Ava texted, "Did you do it?" And I replied, "Dad will handle it," and I could almost feel her relief through the screen. Relief built on my sacrifice, and the night grew quieter, the kind of quiet that feels staged, and at exactly 11:58 p.m. my phone buzzed with an alert from the banking app, "Login attempt. New device," and my heart slowed instead of racing, because this was it, and then another alert, "Trust account access requested," and then the most important line, "Monitored hold activated," and I imagined my father at my mother's kitchen table, laptop open, his jaw set with entitlement, telling himself he was doing what was necessary, telling himself I'd forced his hand, and on the bank's side, Mr. Chen would be watching the attempt like a footprint in fresh snow, and seconds later, a third alert arrived, "Transfer initiated, pending review," and my breath caught, because even knowing the trap was set didn't stop the sting of seeing my father try to take what was mine, and then the final alert appeared, "Transaction blocked, fraud unit notified," and I closed my eyes, because the attempt was recorded now, permanent, and at 12:07 a.m. Elaine called, voice steady, "It's done," and I whispered, "He tried," and she replied, "And now he's caught," and sleep didn't come, not because I was afraid, but because the night felt like a hinge, something turning, and at 7:32 a.m. my phone rang again. This time it was my mother, her voice frantic, "Olivia, what did you do?" And I sat up slowly, "What happened?" I asked softly, and she sobbed, "The bank called, they froze our accounts, they said there's an investigation," and behind her I could hear my father's voice shouting, muffled but furious, "Give me the phone," and then he was on, breath harsh, "You set me up," he spat, and I kept my voice calm, "No, Dad," I said, "you set yourself up when you tried to steal from me," and he exploded, "I was saving your sister," and I replied quietly, "You were saving your reputation," and there was a pause, the kind where even he realized the truth landed, because Ava's fraud was already a crime, but his attempt to cover it by taking my trust was a second one, clearer, documented, undeniable, and Elaine's email arrived minutes later with a subject line that felt like finality, "Formal investigation opened. Unauthorized trust access," and by noon, Ava's company placed her on administrative leave pending inquiry, not because I reported her, but because fraud leaves trails, and my father's advisory role was suspended while the board reviewed his involvement, because institutions don't like scandal, and my father's threats suddenly meant nothing against the cold machinery of compliance. And that afternoon, my father showed up at my door, not late-night powerful, not commanding, just furious and afraid. "Open up," he shouted, and I didn't. I spoke through the door calmly. "Dad, you threatened my career. You tried to take my future, and now the bank has everything," and his voice cracked. "Fix it," and I almost laughed, because fix it was always what they said when consequences arrived, and I answered softly, "I'm not fixing what you broke," and silence followed. Then my mother's voice, smaller, "Please, we're family," and I rested my forehead against the door, feeling grief like a dull ache. "Family doesn't hold you hostage," I whispered. "Family doesn't steal," and 3 weeks later, Ava entered a restitution agreement to avoid harsher charges. My father resigned from the board, his name permanently marked in the audit reports, and the threats that once felt like power dissolved into paperwork he couldn't intimidate, and I sat with Elaine one final time as she closed the file and said gently, "You did the right thing," and I nodded, because revenge wasn't screaming, it wasn't. Handcuffs are headlines, it was a silent trap that forced truth into the open, and my father learned something he never expected. You cannot burn someone's career and still call it love. You cannot demand payment for another person's crime and escape the consequences of your own. And when midnight came again, the world was quieter, not because the storm never happened, but because it had finally passed, leaving me standing in the only place I had ever wanted to stand, safe, unowned, free.